Good afternoon, Dr. Raine. My apologies to you for having been delayed a little bit in the start of your session. This morning's session was continuing, but it's now time for yours. Let me explain how things are done. I think you would have picked this up from having been here earlier, but in any event, let me tell you, in the room there are a number of people who have been infected and affected. On your left, there are lawyers, including Ms. Richards, who will ask you the questions once you have been sworn. On the back left, there are representatives of the press. You will be talking, however, to an audience beyond this room, both in this building, but more particularly, more numerously, I should say, on YouTube and in live stream. They will number somewhere in the three-figure bracket. Mary.
Please state your full name.
I am June Munro Raine.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Dr. Raine, you're the current Chief Executive of the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, which I'll call the MHRA for short.
Yes.
And you've been in that role since 2019.
Yes.
Now, you're a qualified doctor, but is it right to understand that since the mid-1980s, you've worked in the field of the regulation of medicines and medical devices?
That's correct.
I just want to, before we look briefly at your career, understand the various different bodies and how they've changed over time, because I think you've worked for a number of different incarnations of the licensing authorities. So in the 1970s and 80s, the regulation of medicines was undertaken by divisions within the Department of Health.
Yes.
And we've certainly seen reference to the medicines division in a number of documents from that time. And then is it right to understand that the Medicines Control Agency took over that role of regulation of medicines in 1989?
Yes.
And then the Medical Devices Agency was created in around 1993, I think, for the regulation of medical devices.
Yes.
And then in 2003, the MHRA was established, assuming the responsibilities of both the Medicines Control Agency and the Medical Devices Agency.
That's correct.
And then in 2013, the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control merged with the MHRA.
Yes.
Now, as another part of the system of regulation, we've had the Committee on the Safety of Drugs, which by the 1970s was the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. Is that right?
Yes.
And then, are you able to assist us with understanding where the Medicines Commission fits into that hierarchy or that role?
The Medicines Commission was the body which heard appeals against the advice of the Committee on Safety of Drugs or Committee on Safety of Medicines at the time when we were not part of the European Union, so it was, if you like, a second appeal body.
And then is it right to understand that since 2005 or thereabouts, we've had the Commission on Human Medicines, which combines the functions of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines and the Medicines Commission?
It really comprised the functions of the Committee on Safety of Medicines. In terms of the Commission on Human Medicines, there are panels appointed to hear further appeals.
Now, in terms of your own role, you joined the Medicines Division of the Department of Health as a senior medical officer in 1985.
Yes.
And you were working on the review of medicines at that time. What did that entail?
That entailed reviewing medicines on the market when the initial Medicines Act came into force, which were given product licenses of right. And it was therefore the task of looking at their safety, efficacy and quality to award or not full product licenses.
Then in 1989, you became a group manager in the Medicines Control Agency, overseeing post-authorisation licensing activities. What, in broad terms, did that entail?
Once a medicine is licensed, it undergoes a number of changes or evolves in terms of benefits and risks. And therefore, my role included variations or updates, including safety changes, and renewals, the point at which an overall picture is taken of benefits and risks.
And then between 1992 and 2005, you were Principal Assessor to the Medicines Commission. What did that role involve?
That was a role by which advice was given to the chair and the members of the Medicines Commission, and incorporated making sure the meetings went to the points at issue and delivered a fair hearing for those companies who were presenting.
And then you became, and I think the date was 1998, you became Director of the Post-Licensing Division of the Medicines Control Agency, and then you've described in your statement that became what was called the Vigilance and Risk Management of Medicines Division in 2006. That involved a responsibility for the yellow card scheme, is that correct?
Yes.
And we'll come back to the yellow card scheme at a later stage. And then is that the role in which you remained until you became Chief Executive of the MHRA?
Yes. In 2019, I became interim Chief Executive, and that was made substantive in February 2021.
And you've also been involved in a number of working parties. You've chaired a working party, a European working party on pharmacovigilance. In 2012, you became chair of the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee of the European Medicines Agency.
Yes.
And you have been a member and co-chair of the WHO, World Health Organization Advisory Committee on the Safety of Medicinal Products.
Yes.
Just in terms of terminology, can you help us with this? Could you tell us from your professional perspective what you understand by pharmacovigilance, or what we should understand by it?
Pharmacovigilance is the discipline of understanding the risks of a medicine and taking action to manage and minimise those risks and communicate them to everyone who uses a medicine, health professional or patient, so that they can use a medicine to maximum benefit and minimum risk.
And hemovigilance is essentially, is this right, the same concept but in relation specifically to blood and blood components? Essentially,
yes.
And we'll pick up in rather more detail ideas in relation to hemovigilance with the witnesses that we have coming on Wednesday. Can I turn then to the MHRA in its current incarnation? What does it do? What is its role and its principal responsibilities?
The MHRA, Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, is the UK regulator for medicines, medical devices and blood components for transfusion, and its role is to ensure that these are safe, acceptably safe, that they work, and that they're made to the highest standards of manufacture.
And I think your statement tells us that I think until 2022, the MHRA's activities were undertaken by 3 centres or bodies within the MHRA. So there was the MHRA as regulator, there was the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control, and then there was something called the Clinical Practice Research Data Link. But now those are effectively all one body or one organisation, is that right?
Yes, the opportunity after EU exit, and in the light of the Cumberledge Review, the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, was an important time to look at how medicines and medical devices are optimally regulated, and to take advantage of bringing together basic science, laboratory science, the methodologies to regulate, and real-world data. The Clinical Practice Research Data Link is a large data set of over a quarter of GP practices that give us a very good understanding of safety in the real world.
If we just have your witness statement up on screen, please. Lawrence, it's WITN 7135001. And we go to page 6. In paragraph 3.3, you set out what the MHRA is currently responsible for. So A, ensuring that medicines, medical devices and blood components for transfusion meet applicable standards of safety, quality and efficacy. B, ensuring that the supply and distribution of medicines, medical devices and blood components are safe. C, promoting international standardisation and assuring the effectiveness, safety and quality of biological medicines through the development and provision of standards and reference materials, controlled testing, carrying out applied research and providing scientific advice. D, informing the public and healthcare professionals about the risks and benefits of medicines, medical devices and blood components, supporting safe use. And E, contributing to the development of UK and international regulatory frameworks for medical products so that they are risk proportionate, effective and remain relevant in protecting public health as medicine, science and technology continue to advance. Now, just to ensure that we understand what's covered by those 5 areas, would it be right to understand that subparagraph A, is that essentially talking about the licensing or market authorisation process?
Yes, because it talks to meeting standards, but then at the time of licensing, our knowledge and the evidence on which a licence is approved may be less complete. So there is an ongoing role throughout a product's life cycle to ensure that our understanding and the information for health professionals and patients is as complete and up-to-date as possible.
And I'll come back and ask you more about that process in due course. And then B, ensuring that the supply and distribution of medicines, medical devices and blood components are safe. What does that essentially encompass?
It's everything to do with a supply chain, and that may include storage facilities and so forth, and guarding against dangers such as counterfeit and so forth. So it's a broad range of activities that ensure that when a member of the public or a patient gets a medicine or is treated with a device or receives a blood component, that everywhere from the manufacture through to the bedside in hospital or at home from the pharmacy has been done to the highest standards of good manufacturing and good distribution practice.
And then subparagraph C, does that essentially describe what was the work of the National Institute for Biological Standards and Control?
In essence, yes.
D, informing public and healthcare professionals about risks and benefits and so on. Again, we'll come back to, but is it right to understand from this that the current MHRA regards that as part of its role? So it's not just a question of the labels that go on products or the leaflets that accompany products. The MHRA has a distinct role in ensuring that the public and healthcare professionals are informed about safety and risk issues.
Yes, clearly a leaflet, particularly a printed leaflet, may be extant for some time, depending on the shelf life. So it's important that we use all other mechanisms at our disposal to ensure that people have up-to-date information.
And then E, is it right to understand that's looking at the broader regulatory role and how the MHRA then fits with and interacts with other healthcare bodies within the United Kingdom and internationally?
Yes, the industry that produces medicines, medical devices is an international one, and therefore to keep pace and to continue to be risk proportionate, our international relationships and partnerships are critically important.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, I'm just going to ask you, if you can, to talk us through the typical process of an application for, in terms of the MHRA's role, an application or consideration of an application for what we in the inquiry have called a product licence, but which I think has more recently been referred to as a market authorisation. Is there any difference between a product licence and a market authorisation?
No, they are identical. Marketing authorisation is the term used in European law. Essentially, it's exactly the same as a product licence.
So I'm going to, for ease of reference, refer to a product licence. But what is the essential process that's followed if a product licence application is submitted by a pharmaceutical company to the MHRA? what does the MHRA then do?
The application will be assessed in terms of the data meeting standards for safety, quality and efficacy. And it may be helpful to the inquiry simply to say that the understanding generally starts much earlier with the approval of applications for clinical trials, and those in turn will be made once there is a good understanding of how a medicine works in the laboratory or in animals. So there's a build-up of knowledge before we actually receive an application. And in today's world, we often are working in a rolling review rather than waiting until every piece of data is assembled and checked. So there will be a knowledge base by the time an application is received. Once it is received, there are teams of clinicians, scientists, statisticians, toxicologists who will carefully analyse the data with the important task of balancing benefit and risk and being very clear on the robustness of the evidence in front of them, but taking a risk proportionate view that we need to strike a balance not to hold up patients waiting for unnecessary further checks. On the other hand, to make sure that those evidence standards, often international standards, have been met. Once the assessors have completed their task of critical appraisal, we generally consult for a new product the advice of the Commission on Human Medicines, which provides an independent view on the data and the analyses. And at that point, when advice is given, there may well be a ministerial decision, or the MHRA, as an executive arm of the licensing authority, is able to decide that the benefits outweigh the risks for a particular population, in a particular dose, for example, with suitable advice on monitoring, perhaps warnings, precautions, or the side effects that we have seen in clinical trials. But it's a provisional judgment to the extent that only when a medicine is used in a large population are we able to pick up very rare or perhaps the kind of risks that are only seen in long-term use. And so to complete the picture, the process will include a risk management plan which distills the safety evidence, proposes studies to fill the gaps in evidence, and sets out clear ways in which known risks can be managed or minimised, and that's the risk management plan. And the product life cycle will comprise ongoing work which in our new tools, with our new tools, can be almost in real time, looks at that evolving picture on safety. So I hope that sets out the picture and the approach we take. There are, of course, different procedures with timelines for a product application that may be national, or that it may be made with reference to a European decision. And of course, in Northern Ireland, the European legislation applies under the protocol. So there are procedural nuances, but in essence, our job is to safeguard public health by ensuring that an application meets the standards of safety, quality, and efficacy.
And would it be right to understand that as part of that process, the MHRA can and will look at the information that is going to be available to clinicians and to patients about side effects and risks? So it can look at what's on the label, it can look at what's in the product inserts, patient information leaflets. And would it be right to understand that the MHRA can say, well, you have to make this risk information more prominent if you want a license?
Yes, the documents that you're describing are adjuncts to the license. The full information, we call it the summary of product characteristics, that guides a healthcare professional on how to use the product. But in equivalent and equally complete terms, although in comprehensible language, what a patient will receive, so that there's nothing hidden, nothing that's left out, but presented in comprehensible language. And indeed, we are often able to highlight specific precautions or warnings that a member of the public or a patient can do something about. So it's a very useful document.
And is it part of the MHRA's power to impose conditions on a product licence?
Yes, and to put time frames around those conditions.
And can you give us an example or two of the kind of conditions that the MHRA might put on a licence?
Without perhaps mentioning a name, but if there was a new contraceptive pill, we might wish to see a study on blood clots, which is something that we've been concerned about in the past. And we would wish to see a representative study of adequate size in the population using the product, conducted to a time frame that gives us important new information.
And then once the licence is granted, you've touched on this already in your evidence, the role of the MHRA is then not over, but continues in terms of a process of ongoing monitoring of, in particular, for our purposes, the safety of the product. Is that right?
Yes, it's vital that we fill in knowledge gaps, but also that we're ready to detect perhaps unexpected new emerging risks and to act very promptly on those. And for those purposes, we have a new Chief Safety Officer running a safety and surveillance division that actually aligns medicines and medical devices and uses technology that helps rapidly identify new risks.
Is that Dr. Cave?
Yes.
Who we'll be hearing from on Wednesday. And then, is it usual that when a product is licensed that the pharmaceutical company, in receipt of that license, will have to provide ongoing safety updates?
Yes, it is. They are under a duty to provide periodic safety update reports at periodicity that's determined in our legislation, and also if they are in possession of any new or emerging information to tell us without delay.
And then what powers, again in broad terms, does the MHRA have in terms of revoking a licence or requiring a product to be withdrawn from the market?
It's a fundamental power of a regulatory authority to be able to suspend or to revoke. Suspensory powers would be used if there is an urgent risk to public health and there needs to be time without the product in use while a risk is evaluated. Revocation is usually a longer procedure where a company may wish to provide alternative proposals or reasons and ways a restricted product might be used. We may use a variation, an update to a licence to restrict its use.
If we just go back to your statement, please, WYTN 7135001. And if we go to the bottom of page 6, paragraph 3.5 at the bottom. So this is in terms of the status of the MHRA. You say this: as an executive agency of the Department of Health and Social Care, the MHRA is able to protect public health with scientific integrity, independence in regulatory decision-making, operational delivery, and the necessary level of ministerial oversight and accountability to command public confidence. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of issues there. First of all, in terms of ministerial oversight, what is the typical, if there is a typical, degree of ministerial oversight of the MHRA's activities?
The framework document does set out quite helpfully some of the levels of oversight, but there are regular meetings, particularly quarterly, to look at how our accountabilities are delivered. And our relationship via our sponsor department in the Department of Health and Social Care, our sponsor team enables us to be held to account in terms of delivering our obligations.
And other than accountability to the Department of Health and Social Care and its ministers, is there any other body or organisation or parliamentary committee to whom the MHRA is directly accountable?
Our accountability, I would say, is to our ministers and department. I believe that the Health and Social Care Select Committee would be a key focal point for holding us to account. I would need to think a little further if there are any other important. Clearly, if there is a statutory inquiry such as this one, obviously this is a really important discussion for us to be having.
And then in terms of independence, the MHRA is obviously institutionally independent of the pharmaceutical industry, but equally it obviously has a very close working relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. How does the MHRA ensure that working relationship has proper boundaries?
It's important that we have a clear conflict of interest policy so that our staff do not hold interests, and our advisory committees are certainly similarly subject to clear processes of conflict of interest. And overall, the way we train our staff and so forth is to help to set that boundary while working closely with developers and understanding the science and technology that they're using. So there is inevitably a dynamic there which is interactive. And I think a very important safeguard is our independent Commission on Human Medicines, where there is a separate and statutory responsibility to advise health ministers.
And following the Cumberledge review, and we'll come back to the specific aspects of that review in due course, but have any particular steps been taken by the MHRA following that review to create further distance with the pharmaceutical industry?
We've reviewed our conflicts of interest policy for all our committee members and taken steps too in terms of our internal governance, our board, non-executives and executives. And as you will perhaps see, that these are taken very rigorously every time the board meets to be absolutely open and transparent about it.
Want to then pick up on the section in your statement. If we go to page 8, for detection of emerging risks. Now, you identify there, in this section of your statement, a range of different ways in which the MHRA may detect emerging risks from the use of medicines, etc. The first that you've identified is the obligation on manufacturers to report adverse incidents to the MHRA. In practice, is it the MHRA's experience that those obligations are complied with? Was that an impossible question?
It is our experience to the extent that we have never needed to prosecute a company for failure to comply, although we watch timelines very rigorously, and there are clear timelines set for companies. So to the extent, as I say, we haven't actually taken steps to have a prosecution, you would say that the system is rigorously enforced. Our inspectors, we have good pharmacovigilance practice, are a very important source of advice and instruction and guidance to companies as to how to meet this vitally important obligation.
If we go to the next page, you then identify in paragraphs 4.3 and 4.4 two areas for detecting emerging risks in relation to blood, and that's the Serious Adverse Blood Reactions and Event Scheme, SABRE, and the Serious Hazards of Transfusion Shot system. I'm not going to ask you more about that, Dr. Raine, at least for present purposes, because we're going to be hearing more on those systems on Wednesday in some detail. But the fourth process you identify in paragraph 4.5 is the yellow card scheme. Can you, first of all, tell us what the yellow card scheme currently is? And bearing in mind you've been involved with it for some considerable period of time, how, if at all, it's changed over the time you've been dealing with it?
Currently, the yellow card scheme is actually, as it was initially intended, a notification and alerting mechanism for any user of a medicine, now it's any, not the doctors and dentists and coroners as it originally was, to inform us of a suspicion that a medicine or a medical device may have caused harm to a patient. And today, our main reporter base, if I can use that word, is members of the public. During the COVID-19 pandemic, members of the public told us fulsomely about what they had experienced with COVID-19 vaccines. And so today is functioning as a very, very effective alarming system, alerting system for us. Obviously, there are limitations, which we may well touch on if that would be helpful. And to redress those, we use other sources of data, such as the clinical practice research data link that we've mentioned. The second part, I believe, was how the scheme has evolved. Its original establishment in the wake of the thalidomide tragedy was to ensure that doctors, dentists and coroners would report, but by 2005, health professionals, including the entire health professional team, pharmacy, nursing, had been involved, and by 2005, patient reporting was beginning to be established. The other way, as well as expanding people who can report, that we have improved the scheme is making it easier to report using technology, an electronic web form, and now an app that can go on your phone. So making it easy, reaching out to the maximum number of people using medicines, but there's always more to be doing, and there will never be a complete reporting, except perhaps in some unusual cases, and therefore we need to look to other ways to pick up emerging risks.
And just in terms of the current practice, I think it's right, you can simply go online and Google yellow card. I did it myself last night, and there is something you can essentially, as a member of the public, submit your observation of a side effect or a harm that you've experienced.
Yes, and we very much welcome members of the public doing this.
We'll come back to this when we look at aspects of the Cumberledge review, but how embedded is the yellow card scheme in clinical practice, in your experience?
All GP software systems now include the ability to report. Where I believe we need to go further to embed reporting is in the hospital care system. There have been some successful pilots, but as we seek to make the MHRA better engaged and our systems more integrated with healthcare, it is to the hospital sector we'll look to improve reporting.
If I take you back in time to the 1990s, which I think is when you were first involved in relation to, or directly involved in relation to the yellow card scheme, when reports came in, how would they be analysed or addressed or responded to?
In the early days, the number of reports coming in did permit case-by-case review for causality, whether the medicine may have likely caused the adverse effect or the harm, the side effect. But we then were able to develop statistically based algorithms where the computer system itself would tell us if there was a trend, unusual numbers of reports that we would need to look into quickly. And that has greatly assisted rapid identification of new alarm bells, new signals.
So that would potentially pick up something that is different or new. What about, however, where what is being reported is something that was a known risk? We know through the work of this inquiry that hepatitis transmission was a known risk of factor concentrates in the 1970s and 1980s. So, but I'm not asking you about that specific example, but something that's a known risk. It might be a risk that's identified in the product inserts. So it's not a new side effect, but is nonetheless coming through and being reported. What, if anything, does the MHRA do in response to such information?
What we would do would be to look to investigate further by means of data sets where the denominator is known. In other words, the number of exposed treated people is better understood and captured, because then we can look at what we're observing versus what we might expect to see in that population. It means moving from what's termed spontaneous data through to more organised data sets such as registries and so forth, and then potentially undertaking studies that might confirm or refute a change such as you're describing.
refer in your statement, I don't think we need to specifically put it up on screen, but in comparing the current yellow card scheme with the previous one, you say that the MHRA is no longer reliant on a limited number of paper reports from a small number of health professionals as in the past. Is it right to understand that the yellow card scheme, at least in its early decades, was very much dependent upon the will of an individual clinician submitting this paper or fax transmission to the MHRA or its predecessors?
Yes, although even now it takes someone's intuition or suspicion and willingness to report that even if it's an electronic report, someone has taken the time and effort to do that.
And then can I just ask you to look at paragraph 4.6? It should be on the screen. So you've described in the preceding paragraph 4.5, the way in which the yellow card scheme currently operates. And then you say this in 4.6, that the new MHRA Safety Connect digital technology development programme now enables the MHRA to use specialist software to configure smart forms using conditional logic and schedule requests for additional information automatically based on the content of an initial yellow card report. Could you simplify that and tell us what that means?
The important message from Cumberledge, the Independent Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review, was that we need to be responsive and much more interactive. And in this case, given we get many more reports, and thankfully we do now, our new technology can help to prompt follow-up questions depending on what has been told to us. So this would mean that if a report came in on a woman in her childbearing years, the questions around using a medicine in pregnancy might arise, and that the system can look at the initial data set and, depending on those conditions, logically ask for further data. It gives us a much better interaction with people and takes away some of the ad hoc nature of follow-up, because many people have felt that when a report was submitted to us, they didn't hear very much, and therefore a dialogue or an interactive, a responsive system can be greatly assisted by Safety Connect.
And then paragraph 4.7, you refer to further work being ongoing to make even more effective use of technology. The first example you've given, I think you've already told us about, so the integration of the yellow card with other NHS systems such as the NHS app. So a yellow card report can effectively be done from your phone. And then you refer to the new learning from patient safety event system. Can you tell us what that is, please?
There was an existing NHS data set called NRLS, the National Reporting and Learning System, which gathered a very great deal of information from the NHS, which would be useful to us, particularly in relation to events with medical devices. It's now becoming the learning from patient safety events. And given that we are using better our digital technology to have application program interfaces, that systems will talk to each other, and therefore very often it helps us to understand. I think there was one situation where NRLS had collected data on children being given the wrong dose of paracetamol in hospital, whereas yellow cards had very few cases. The NRLS helped us understand the near misses that were happening. So very important that we bring these data sets together.
And what work is being undertaken by the MHRA or the MHRA in conjunction with other bodies to try and ensure that clinicians make full use of the yellow card scheme?
It's a really important question. We have an annual event where we encourage reporting, and we work with other countries to do this, to get messages out. And at the moment we're also consulting publicly on how risk communication, both ways, into us and from us, should be integrated in health professionals' working lives. So we're trying to understand better the limitations, the underreporting and so forth before we come forward with some more proposals. But it is an inherent difficulty that we have addressed in the past by facilitation, making it easier to report, education and promotion, but somehow we've not quite cracked making it a systemic role of a health professional, which it truly needs to be.
And then in the, paragraph 4.8 at the bottom of the page, you also identify as another source of information about potential emerging risks the MHRA's own review of published medical literature. And is that undertaken by the MHRA on an international scale? So you're looking at literature from across the world?
We certainly do, and we expect companies also to do so and to inform us as an additional effort if they find something, to make sure that we're all looking at the latest of the published literature.
We can take that down, thank you for now. Could you just then tell us a little more about the benefit risk assessment process, whether it's at the initial product licensing stage or subsequently when you've granted a license, you've got more information and there might need to be a further assessment. Typically, what kind of other bodies or groups or cohorts would those undertaking the assessment for the MHRA consult with as part of that assessment process?
Internally, we have scientists, clinicians who become very familiar with a particular therapeutic area and are organised in teams that gather evidence, so the context in which benefit risk is being looked at, particularly alternatives available in a therapeutic area, is well understood. Our main go-to is then the Commission on Human Medicines and its expert advisory groups. So, for example, there's a Medicines for Women's Health advisory group. There are biological groups. And so they would be very aware, again, of the therapeutic area. Frontline clinicians, some of international repute, who would be able to give their views on benefit risk. Benefit risk has been something we've looked at, if you like, modelling, mathematical criteria, decision criteria analysis. In the end, the judgment of experienced staff and health professionals is what we use to reach a decision.
And what role in that process, again, in general terms, does the availability of other forms of treatment play? So, again, just to contextualise it in terms relevant to this inquiry, it may be said in relation to the licensing of factor concentrates in the 1970s, known to transmit hepatitis, that there were safer existing alternatives such as the use of cryoprecipitate. Again, I don't invite you to comment on those specific treatments, not something you were involved in at the time. But when the MHRA's assessors are looking at benefit risk, or the MHRA is taking a decision, is the availability of an alternative, safer treatment a factor that goes into the assessment and decision-making process?
Yes. I'm pausing because I can remember the old Medicines Act did enable us, particularly in post-authorisation decisions, to consider if a product was less safe than available alternatives. The EU system was geared to only look at benefit risk in isolation, but more recently, I think there has been a more mature approach to that. But the availability of alternatives should always be part of that judgment.
May I just ask, you've been asked about something very historical. Can I put it into the modern context? You mentioned a moment or two ago how a decision might have to be made about a new contraceptive. And one of the issues there was whether it gave what risk of thrombosis there was by using it. If, let us suppose, that application for a new contraceptive showed, when you looked at the information available, that the risk was higher than those already existing on the market, would the consequence, do you think, be that the marketing authorization would be refused?
It could be, but I may not have given you a very good example, sir, because these products would be used in healthy people, so you would take a very rigorous look at risk. If the risk was very small, we would be asking whether the evidence we had enabled us to make a judgment about those differences and how significant they were.
Thank
can I then turn to the question of public and patient involvement and transparency of decision-making? And again, just to put it in context, our understanding in relation to decision-making in the 1970s, 1980s is that there was very little that was shared publicly, decisions of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines and reports that were confidential and so on. Now, obviously, there are always going to be considerations of commercial confidentiality, but in broad terms, what parts of the MHRA's decision-making processes are published or publicly available?
Today, the minutes and proceedings of our Commission on Human Medicines are publicly available. We aim to publish a public assessment report for new products or for major safety decisions, and to communicate that often with a lay summary so that the niceties of whatever analyses are made fully accessible. So those are the main ways at the moment.
And are the benefit risk assessments publicly available?
Not all of them, but when we publish a public assessment report, that's the core of that public assessment report.
And is that a report on every individual application that's published, or is...
No, not at the moment.
So what's the current... In terms of the kind of reports that would be produced at the moment, are they just on certain licenses, or are they a summary of the year's activity, or how does it work?
Yeah, there certainly is an annual report which the Commission on Human Medicines delivers, but not in the kind of detail I think you're thinking of. It's only a proportion of approvals that would be accompanied by a public assessment report, and I would like to check exactly how that, and let you know the precise detail. And
do you know, and again, if you have to check and come back to us on that, that's fine, but do you know how the decision is taken as to which ones would be published and which ones would not?
Yes, it would be important it would be new drugs, new products.
And then can you tell us a little about the role of patients or patient representative organisations in the processes that you've been describing? Again, we have looked at a period of time, in particular in the inquiry, where there appears to have been little or frankly no involvement of patients or patient groups in the licensing decision-making processes. What's the current position?
Well, the current position is very different, that we involve patients in our innovative licensing and access pathway, looking at a very early discussion on the kinds of trials that will be needed. We're increasingly using patient-reported outcome measures in trials. And then when it comes to our Commission on Human Medicines, of course, there are patient representatives. We have a patient group consultative forum that can take an overall view, as well as occasionally members of that forum coming for specific topics. And in safety, we've more recently been opening up our Commission on Human Medicines discussions to patients from a breadth of patient involvement, giving their advice and their views. So it's improving a lot, but there's still a long way to go.
You gave an example in your statement of how patient involvement could affect regulatory decisions, of engagement with patients with diabetes, informing a national patient safety alert. How did that work?
This was around a concern about an insulin pump. Clearly, patients have a choice of having injections or a pump that we understood from their input made a huge difference to their lives. So in terms of if there needed to be a recall or stringent regulatory action, how that would affect people. So their input to those judgments was very important.
And then going back to the question I asked about the MHRA's scrutiny of the information that accompanies a medicine in terms of information about risks and side effects, does the MHRA's processes involve patients at that stage in trying to understand how patients would understand what's written on the draft product insert, rather than just how clinicians might understand it?
We undertake user testing, and that may convey that there's a huge input. In fact, it's more about how usable the leaflet is rather than its effectiveness in communicating risk. And what we want to do, it may be one of the freedoms from not being part of the EU, is to give much more about benefit and risk rather than simply whether you can locate information that you need to find in a leaflet, which is what user testing does.
There's a patient involvement strategy which you've exhibited to your statement. If we could just have a look at that. It's WITN 7135003. So patient involvement strategy 2021 to 2025. If we go to the third page, we see the heading strategic objectives and then patient and public involvement objective. And you say there, we'll develop and introduce clear processes for engagement and involvement, etc. We intend to deliver and have these processes embedded across the agency by December 2022. How close is the MHRA to achieving that? Is the work outlined in this strategy going to be embedded across the agency by that date?
We are just about to produce our one-year report, and it's fair to say that with the challenge of introducing training for staff and a range of measures throughout the product life cycle, it has been a bigger task than I think was first envisaged. And so, again, well before the inquiry finishes, we'll be able to provide the one-year report and the explanations why some aspects of the work have been easier to take forward than others. We've already been saying that benefit risk communication is a challenging issue, and there are different views about how that should be done, and that will be subject to a more considered view. So it won't be embedded by December.
And I won't go through all the detail, but there are a number of examples. If we look at the bottom of the page, there are a number of examples of how the MHRA proposed to try and ensure greater patient and public involvement. Continues over the page. Again, with the range of bullet points there. As I say, I won't go through them, but will the report that you're referring to help us understand which of those the agency has been able to introduce and embed,
Yes.
and which it hasn't?
Yes, it will. Just as the report goes by, it's going to our Patient Safety and Engagement Committee. I believe it's this week, so you would see it shortly after that.
And then, can I then ask you a little about the way in which the MHRA provides information to clinicians and to patients and the public? So moving away now from specific products and the information that might accompany a specific medicine to the more general dissemination of information and safety information about the MHRA. Your statement refers to something called the monthly drug safety update. What is that, and to whom does that go?
This is an electronic bulletin that covers current regulatory actions or new information of relevance to a healthcare professional, which is sent by email to healthcare professionals. I would, though, stress that in the busy work of healthcare professionals, our pick-up rate, which we've looked at, isn't what we would like it to be. And that's the reason for the current consultation that's running until January, really to find out how healthcare professionals want to receive information and what is the easiest way for them to assimilate that. It's quite an ask for people to read a long article unless it's an issue of great interest to them as a specialist.
And just in terms of the current system, does that update go to every single doctor in the country, or does it go to a hospital to distribute amongst its clinicians?
It goes through a provider, the name used to be Binley's, and I could check on that actually disseminates for a number of bodies to healthcare professionals.
So
Direct.
So it should go directly to every doctor. And then there's something called the National Patient Safety Alert. We referred to it when I asked you about the insulin pump issue. What's the National Patient Safety Alert? How does that operate?
The National Patient Safety Alert, in terms of mechanism, goes from our central alerting system. Its content is agreed with NHS England Improvement through a series of discussions to make sure that how we present an issue is actionable by a health professional who receives it.
And is that more targeted in its in its distribution, or does it go to, intended to go to every clinician?
It goes through a hospital cascade, I believe, but I might need to give you the facts on that.
And then, so would it be right to understand those are the two main mechanisms whereby the MHRA communicates information to clinicians?
Yes, and the National Patient Safety Alert is for urgent or more serious issues, perhaps where there's been a serious or significant outcome. The drug safety update is to keep people updated and often an early information followed by more mature advice.
What about then the public, either the public at large or particular patient organisations, patient representative groups? What does the MHRA do in terms of providing information more generally to either to the public or to sectors of the public?
We have a communications division, team, group, who are able to use press statements and the usual, if you like, modern media can be through social media and so forth, depending on the issue at hand. And the fallback is that we would work, not fallback, in parallel with patient organisations, depending on the issue, to make sure we get maximum outreach.
So if there were a developing concern about a drug in relation to Alzheimer's, for example, would it be right to understand that you, and this is I appreciate hypothetical, you might then try and work with the Alzheimer's Society to ensure that it's understood by them? Yes,
it has happened actually. There was a drug used in the population that caused stroke, and so we worked closely with the Alzheimer's community and patient organisations to make sure that the action we were advising was quickly known to those in terms of caring obligations.
And in terms of the MHRA providing information to the public at large, that is something that was done by you indeed during the COVID pandemic, talking about the approval in relation to COVID vaccines. There were press conferences, I think, in which you addressed what was being done. Is that something that has effectively emerged out of the COVID pandemic, or was that something which the MHRA had done previously?
It has been done, but not to the same extent. It wasn't the first time, but I do think now we are much more ready to go out and engage and to work with journalists and the media to make sure that the information we're providing is presented in ways that people can act on and not be subject to confusion or alarm.
And then if someone, a patient, member of the public, wants to find information about the safety record or safety concerns associated with a particular product, or reports about new and emerging risks, to what extent is that information publicly accessible on the MHRA's website?
The interactive drug analysis prints, as we call them, or profiles, because they're electronic now, are accessible and they're regularly updated. However, to understand and make good use of them would require looking at other data sources or information sources, such as product information that's also accessible electronically.
So is there anywhere that you're aware of that a patient could try and find all the available information about a particular drug in one place online?
No, and I think that's something that we will want to look at. We've talked in terms of the health professional will turn to the British National Formulary, but a similar compilation for patients would be a really important step forward in terms of a one-stop shop for useful information and up-to-date information.
I'd then ask you a little about the prescription of medicines on a named patient basis. Medicines that do not have a product licence, market authorisation, but which are used by clinicians specifically for an individual patient. Again, the inquiry has heard evidence about that happening in for example, the 1980s. That is something, as I understand it, which still happens. Does the MHRA have any role in relation to prescription on a named patient basis?
The term, in a sense, raises the expectation, and it has been put to me, that we keep a list of names, and that certainly is not the case. What we're talking about is that a health professional can prescribe an unlicensed or an off-label use, can order for importation an unlicensed product that they consider is in the best interest of the patient in their care. We have provided very clear advice that the professional doing this should satisfy themselves on the evidence and would be advised to tell the patient in their care that the product wasn't licensed. Indeed, if it's off-label, the patient may get a leaflet that doesn't talk about what the condition is they're being treated for, and the health professional to record they've had that discussion so that it is clear that there hasn't been an authorisation of that particular use, the dose, the warnings, and so forth.
And does the MHRA, or to your knowledge, any other body or organisation, undertake any kind of audit or oversight in relation to such usage?
Not to my knowledge. There will be, possibly, just to quickly say, parts of the healthcare community, such as paediatrics, where there have been studies from time to time that have helped to quantify the level of off-label unlicensed use, and as we well know, it increases the younger the child. There are also areas that we're concerned about, prescribing in pregnancy being one of them, where we have very few medicines that are authorised for use in pregnancy with the right dose and the right instructions. So it's an area that we're continuing to look to expand and to get more authorised products for people.
And is the reason that this is not regulated by the MHRA essentially that it falls outside your powers?
Yes.
Is it your view that there should be, not necessarily by the MHRA, but by somebody, some system of regulation for named patient use of unlicensed or off-label drugs?
Yes, I should perhaps stress that when it comes to safety, we can and we do act in terms of if there's a new risk that should be in a product information or a leaflet that pertains to an off-label use, we can and have done that. It's a good question. The freedom of clinicians to do what they believe to be in the best interest of their patients is a fundamental principle of the practice of medicine. So we would need to judge where our most value add could be in this space, and I think it's something to return to.
I'm going to ask you now to turn to the Cumberledge Review. So the report of the Independent in Medicines and Medical Devices Safety Review. I'm afraid I'm using Cumberledge as shorthand. Could we have up on screen, please, RLIT 301379? And what I'm going to do, Dr. Raine, is just draw your attention to a handful of paragraphs. I know this is a report that you are familiar with, and then invite you to tell us what the MHRA has or has not done in response, and any other additional comment that you have in relation to that paragraph. So if we could start on... It's page 5 of the report, Lawrence. I think it'll be page 16 electronically. Oh, no, I've got my numbers completely wrong. Sorry, if we go back to 3 pages then. Thank you. So we can see paragraphs 115 and 116 there set out. I'm not going to read them out in full. But the essential point in paragraph 1.16 was a concern about a lack of vigilant long-term monitoring of the effects of medicines and medical devices. And we see there the review recording that the absence of such monitoring means the system does not know the scale of the problems we were asked to investigate. And then by reference to each of the devices or treatments that the review was looking at, the point is repeated. The system does not know, so neither do we, how many women were treated with this, how many children were born with developmental consequences, and so on. And then if we just go to the bottom of the next page, paragraph 1.17, it says the healthcare system collects a huge amount of information, but it can't answer these fundamental questions. How then can it spot trends and complications and act swiftly and coherently to protect patients and prevent harm? So two questions really in relation to that, Dr. Raine. What's your comment or reflection on what's set out there as a general theme? And what, if anything, has the MHRA done in response to the particular concerns here?
I would like to say that the MHRA has received the Cumberledge Review and its recommendations extremely seriously. We were able to be involved in the review as it took place and listen to the experiences of the women concerned and truly resolved to do something about this. What we're seeing here is the inability to collect long-term information, and so what we've done is to work in the context of the Medicines and Medical Devices Act and then the Health and Care Act to make sure that the MMD Act has the ability to set up data collection systems. And it's absolutely clear that if a regulator cannot quantify and monitor a risk, then it cannot regulate. So it is now a matter for us to establish and implement those data collection systems, and it's something we'll be moving forward with now that we have the legal powers to do so.
And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 120, this talks about the yellow card system and then says in the last sentence, it's clear that there is gross underreporting and our complaint systems are both too complex and too diffuse to allow early signal detection. Again, the same questions, Dr. Raine, comment or observation on that finding and action that the MHRA has taken in response.
It's clear that a spontaneous reporting system is how we describe yellow card will always be inherently limited by underreporting, and that we need to take every step possible to ensure that the confidence is there that will encourage reporting by health professionals, by patients themselves. And our new interactive system, responsive system, I believe will go a very long way to make those reporters feel that they have truly engaged with us and are part of the risk management, the solution that we will deliver. But it is clear that this is a significant challenge for us, and we'll continue to address it.
And then paragraph 122, sorry, 1.22 over the page. This is referring, amongst other things, to gaps identified by NICE and others. It's just the last sentence I wanted to ask you about, Dr. Raine, where the review says this: we heard about research that's funded by manufacturers that never sees the light of day because it's negative or inconclusive for the product in question, or is less than transparent in its declaration of conflicts of interest when positive findings are reported. Again, do you have any, that's not directly aimed at the MHRA, but do you have any observations about that, and what, if any, steps does the MHRA take to try and ensure that all research, whatever the negative or positive nature of its outcome, is reported to you?
Companies who hold licenses have an obligation, legal obligation, to tell us everything both for and against their product. And we enforce that whenever we possibly can. And in fact, whenever we hear from a company in a formal setting, they are immediately asked if they've given everything that they have. So there should never be research that doesn't see the light of day. We are looking to reform the clinical trials legislation, and there are various opportunities now that we have consulted to see if there's more that needs to be done to reinforce this principle. In terms of conflicts of interest, we do work with, there's a consortium of medical journals to ensure that best practice is followed, and particularly publications that may influence medical practice, that there's very clear statements about funding.
Lawrence, if we could turn, it's to internal page 13. So, thank you. Yes, thank you. So paragraph 1.41 then turns specifically to the MHRA, refers to the changes or opportunities created by Brexit. But then again, says this in the last few sentences of that paragraph: the MHRA must work both for patients and with them. Reform underpinned by legislation is needed so that the views of patients are systematically listened to and their experiences of medications and devices are used to inform licensing and regulatory decisions. Now, it's, I think, implicit in that paragraph and explicit elsewhere in the report that the review felt that that hadn't been done or hadn't been done sufficiently. Is again, your observations on that?
As a result of the review and the opportunity to look again at how our organisation works, we have made involving patients, putting patients at the heart of our activities as an obligation, as an objective for every member of staff. And the fact that we're now able to say a year on from publishing our patient involvement strategy, we're looking to that progress in some areas, less quick in others, tells of the resolve that we have in this space. It is a cultural change. It's being driven by our culture action plan and by, I think, experiences including COVID of that respect that we have generated, that patients have told us such valuable things about the products that they're using and their experiences. And so it's a slow process, but the reform is happening and it's becoming embedded. And at every meeting of our Assurance Committee, Patient Safety and Engagement Assurance Committee, we look again at some of the strategic initiatives for change. It's happening. There is still a way to go.
And then paragraph 1.42 refers to the need for more robust publicly accessible post-marketing surveillance. This should include mandatory requirements on healthcare organisations to report adverse events within a designated time period. Now, you've told us about the legal obligations on the holders of product licences to report to you. This appears to be talking about something more general, so healthcare organisations being under an obligation to report adverse events to the MHRA. Do you know what, if anything, is being done in response to that?
The discussions are continuing, and in a sense, with various changes in the healthcare system, now is a more opportune moment to consider at what level there should be an obligation. Some jurisdictions have a mandatory obligation to report at the level of the individual practitioner, and that hasn't been shown to generate more or better information for safety monitoring. Whether there are other hospital level or even integrated care partnership level opportunities to be sure that monitoring is embedded and that we're receiving the results of that monitoring on a very active basis is something that we're looking at. As I say, it has been a sense of finding the best way to do this rather than to say we will not even enter into this, given, as I say, that for some countries that have done this at the practitioner level, there hasn't been a benefit.
And then if we turn to so it's internal page 49, Lawrence. I'm going to rely on you to find the correct electronic page. Thank you. So 2.103, the current regulatory system has been a recurring area of concern for patient groups across all three of our interventions. We recognise that the current pharmaceutical and devices regulatory systems have gaps and inefficiencies in, and then there are 5 bullet points set out. We've touched on some of these, but if I could just ask you to go through each of them and just tell us in a sentence or two by reference to each what the MHRA has done or is proposing to do, if anything, in response in relation to these 5 areas.
Full transparency is not in place, but with the advent, and it's quite soon, of our Safety Connect system, we'll be able to make device adverse incidents publicly available as well as medicines. And it's that levelling up process that we're currently engaged in. This is more than simply adverse events or adverse reactions. It's all our operations that will need to involve patient scrutiny and be done transparently. So it's a step on the way, but there's more to do. Outcomes evaluation is done as needed, but it is ad hoc, and we've published on various occasions the impact of action. But the key word, obviously, Ms. Richards, is systematically, and that again requires the tools, the expertise, and the prospective designing of studies that will look at outcome. So that's again a longer term prospect. Real-time risk assessment based on all relevant sources of evidence, including patient experience, is, I think, coming closer. You will probably have seen that the vigilance system during COVID was largely based on patient experience and came closer to real time because of new tools, one of which is called rapid cycle analysis, using GP real-world clinical data to complement the spontaneous data. So we're getting closer to real time, by which we mean picking up a signal and looking into it as soon as it happens, and then managing to avoid risk. Our systems actually did benefit others, and I was informed last week by the head of Australian regulator that what we did during COVID saved lives in Australia. So wherever in the world we're able to get close to real time, we will see an impact. It might not be on our shores, but let's work internationally to pick that up. The validation of risk management tools by behavioural science is at its earliest stage. The very, I think, interesting ideas around nudge, behavioural change, have been looked at, particularly in the context of valproate, where this anti-epileptic treatment for women, very effective but harmful in pregnancy, has been resistant to health professional uptake of our advice. So we're gradually getting more aware of the tools of behavioural science, and in terms of using medical devices, that again will benefit us. So it's at its earliest stage. And then best practice in risk communication, I've already referred to the fact that this is in our 1-year review, and I think it's time to revisit some of the ways in which people feel that they have really had the best information on risk. Again, the Winton Centre are experts. We use them to help us to convey the risk of clots with one of the COVID vaccines, depending on how prevalent the infection was and the likelihood of going to an ITU with COVID. So there are some real complexities here, but it's a journey that we're starting.
And then if we go over the page, this is under the heading including patients in the public in decision making, and I've asked you a number of questions about that already. But if I can just ask you about some of the specific recommendations here. So paragraph 2.108, second sentence, in our view, when a medical device or medicine safety issue is raised, the MHRA should be subject to binding timescales for decisions on risk management. Such timescales should be set according to the degree of public health urgency. What's the current position in relation to that?
The position, obviously, until January 21 was we adhered to the EU timeframes for signals, validated signals, and public health reviews. It's a really important point that we now embed those in UK law, in operations.
Is there now a statutory legal obligation on the MHRA in terms of timescales, or is that something that you were just voluntarily working to?
I think it's voluntarily, but I will need to check on that. Some of the timeframes were done by guidance in the EU.
And then 2.109, which is about transparency. Again, I've touched on that, but the specific recommendation here was that regulatory decisions should be published together with the fullest possible supporting evidence, evaluation including all areas of uncertainty, and justification for actions. Is that something that the MHRA is going to do?
It's our intention, the preparation of a full public assessment report for every major benefit risk decision, and we're not able to do that at this moment, but that's certainly an intention.
And when you say we're not able to do that at this moment, what is it that's holding up the move to that?
The change in our systems and the resource availability to write a public assessment report for every decision that's made.
And would it not be possible simply to publish your own internal decisions and the evidence that was provided and the benefit risk analysis with redaction, if that's appropriate, on a commercial confidentiality basis, but otherwise simply just publish rather than creating an extra layer of work of finessing this into a report?
We will be able to look into that more once we've got our refreshed technical infrastructure, how readily that could easily be done, but it's a possibility. It's a very real opportunity.
And then over the page, paragraph 2.112, the sentence in bold print, the last sentence of that paragraph, in our opinion, it would greatly aid public understanding if the MHRA gave detailed reasons for its decisions, if they differ from decisions made by another major international regulator. Is that something which is being considered or implemented?
It isn't being actively considered. We usually answer questions like this when they're put to us in a specific case, but I think it's an important point, and one would expect to be able to justify and therefore to make that justification public.
And then if we move to its internal page 53, please, Lawrence, it should be 2 pages further on, I think. So paragraph 2.121 refers to a recommendation, so this is the sentence in bold print, a publicly searchable database, including all adverse events for both medicines and devices. What's the position in relation to that recommendation?
This is what I've referred to as Safety Connect, and the fact that we're linking our public accessibility for adverse events for devices to the availability of that database.
And then if we go to the next page, please. Bottom of the page, paragraph 2.126, again picking it up in the sentence in bold print, this calls for the setting up of a system-wide healthcare intelligence unit to facilitate early signal detection, which would draw on various sources of information, including, for example, databases and registries, pharmacovigilance, and issues raised by the Patient Safety Commissioner. Now this, I don't think, is looking at the MHRA alone. It's looking at a system-wide unit. But do you know what, if any, steps are being taken in relation to that recommendation?
I'm not aware of steps being taken for a system-wide healthcare intelligence unit to be set up per se. What I would say, though, is that the relevant bodies that we very much will have information to exchange with one another, the Care Quality Commission, UK Health Security Agency, HSIB, there are various bodies that are in regular contact, and I know there are steps being taken by the Care Quality Commission to make that a systematic regular contact. Whether that would meet the views of the new Patient Safety Commissioner as effectively establishing this, one needs to think about accountabilities, governance and so forth, but it's an ambition that we really should have.
You mentioned there the Patient Safety Commissioner. That's a role that has come out of this particular review, and there is a Patient Safety Commissioner in place in England now, but not currently, as I understand it, in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, the MHRA is a UK-wide regulator, isn't it?
Yes.
First of all, how does the MHRA envisage working with the Patient Safety Commissioner? How's it anticipated that relationship will work?
It's early with the new post holder coming in to create this really important role as she sees it optimally delivered. it will be very important that we have an independence to our interactions, and yet those interactions are very free and full. And we will rely on the Patient Safety Commissioner always to hold the torch for patients and to be very open and not to hold back anything that she believes we should know about. But it is an evolving picture at this moment. And I think, going to your point about the other devolved administrations, presumably they will have thoughts in this direction too, whether it's in a formalised role or part of a current team. One would wait to see. But I think, as envisaged by Cumberledge, it is a really important step for patients to feel they have this go-to and someone who will have a voice for them in what can seem a very bureaucratic system.
So I know the time. I haven't quite finished my questions, but I'm conscious that although we had a late start, it's getting into the afternoon, and also the stenographers need a break. Can I suggest we take our normal break, but that I encourage by my words the legal representatives to start formulating any further questions they have now, so that the next break we take can be a short one.
Yes, well, let's do exactly that and come back, please, at 4:15. 4:15.
Thank you, sir.